This is the Sigma 100-400 F5-6.3 DG DN OS, a fantastic new addition to all you Sony E mount shooters that are looking for a versatile telephoto lens for wildlife and whatnot, but don't want to shell out all that money for the G Master. We finally have a new addition and something to consider, and I'm happy to tell you that it's pretty darn good. Well, we're breaking it down as usual, everything that you need to know about this lens to figure out whether or not you should be considering it. Let's get started. Welcome back, guys, and yes, we are diving in, checking out the Sigma 100-400, and this is a pretty exciting lens for what it is. There's not a lot available to us in terms of third-party or alternative telephotos in this range, so it's a pretty exciting lens to see. And let's throw up some specs here for you, somewhere up there, to get you going. If you don't know a heck of a lot this, and who would I recommend this lens for? Well, it's not a professional lens, and don't kid yourself, it can produce professional results, but you're gonna find this more in a beginner to an intermediates bag. If you want a professional reliability and build, you're gonna go with the G Master straight up. But overall, I'm excited to show you what this thing is all about because it actually offers a lot. And just a quick shout out to Jamie Seba, who left me an awesome comment in my last video. Just wanted to say I appreciate you, bud, and being part of the community. So I'm sending you this bad boy. It's just a little LED project light for your photo and video needs. Hopefully that helps you out. And so shoot me a message and we'll get this sent out to you. Thanks again, bud. Anyways, as usual, we're diving right in and checking this bad boy out, starting with the build and features. Okay, let's dive in and have a look at what's in the box. And do keep in mind that this is Sigma's contemporary line, it's not the art line, and all you're going to find is a bit of paperwork and the lens and a lens hood. No case, no fancy anything else, that's it, just the lens. For what it is, it's a decent size and weight, measuring 10¼ inches with the lens hood installed, 13¼ fully extended, and only 7¾ without. It weighs in at just about exactly 2.5 pounds, meaning that it's quite reasonable for you to take it traveling or hiking or whatever you're going to do with it. It's also got a zoom lock switch as well as a few other conveniences, including an automatic manual focus switch, a zoom limiting switch, a focus hold button, and a mode selector for your image stabilization. Of course, it does extend as it zooms, but it is a well-balanced lens with most of the weight towards the back of the lens. There is a tripod collar for this lens, but unfortunately it's sold separately, and honestly I really recommend getting it for stability, as when you throw this thing on a tripod at longer distances and lower shutter speeds, you're definitely going to have some shake. The manual focus ring turns quite easily, and its performance is nothing to write home about, although you can dial it into your liking using Sigma's dock. However, it's also sold at an additional cost. On the front, you'll find 67mm filter threads, along with Sigma's proprietary coatings to help with ghosting and flare. On the back, a nice heavy-duty metal mount with a very small and thin rubber gasket, but hey, it's there, so it is technically weather sealed. This lens is definitely reminiscent of my old 150-600, which was one of my first really serious lenses, and a telephoto that really served me well along with the MC11 when I switched over to Sony. However, being a native lens now, it's going to perform a lot better than something adapted. Overall for build, this is a contemporary line, but it's decently built and I give it 4 stars. So now let's touch on the value of this lens, and I'm happy to say that it has incredible value. This is a contemporary line like I mentioned, it's not the best of the best, so don't expect that for the price. Now, its biggest and pretty much only competitor is the Sony 100-400 G Master, which comes in at $2,500 US, quite expensive, but really the best of the best. At around $930 US, this lens is an absolute steal. You can't expect the best quality or performance, but for the average hobbyist, this lens is more than capable. Keep in mind that there will be an additional cost for the tripod collar, a case, and the Sigma dock if need be. But for what it is, with a great warranty thrown in, I give this lens 4.5 stars for value. Okay, so now what matters, let's look at performance. And this lens has lots of it. First, we'll start off by looking at the aperture range and the physical limitations of this lens. Wide open at 100mm, your widest aperture is f5, and unfortunately it's not long into your zoom at about 115mm where you hit the middle of your aperture range f5.6. It's not till 235mm that you get into f6.3, which is your fastest aperture all the way down to 400. This is quite typical of something in this focal range, and just a tiny bit slower than the G Master. It's also worth noting that this lens is a little bit unique in the way that it zooms. You can zoom it with your typical zoom ring, but you can also pull and push the barrel for faster target acquisition. Kind of a neat feature. It does feel a little bit awkward for me as I'm not used to it, but I could see it being kind of neat. Now let's have a look at this lens's autofocus capabilities. For me, obviously one of the most important aspects of a lens, and surprisingly it does quite well even in low light. Now this isn't a video tailored lens, nor is it as fast or as reliable as the G Master, and this is to be expected, but it absolutely does hold its own. Here's an example of an even more extreme low light test, and this is just something that I do. I push these lenses to the limit to give you an idea about what they can do. This is not necessarily what you're going to do with them. And I'm actually surprised at how well it performs. It does slow down quite a bit, but it remains quite accurate with a little bit of hunting, and that's fine. Okay, so here we are with some real world shots, and this is of a subject obviously coming at me with a great deal of speed, and this is head on. This is one of the most strenuous tests you can put on a lens, and I wanted to do this test because this is kind of a wildlife tailored lens. Maybe not so much for professionals or people obsessed with birds. They might need a little bit more reach, but this is a great all-around lens, and you still want it to keep up with most things if you're out shooting, well, wildlife or birds for the day. As you can see here, the first shot is great, but I have to say this lens does struggle a little bit with consistency. It looks like it's just not able to keep up with the speed, and I say my overall hit rate is pretty much just under 50%. So some of the shots are good, but don't rely on this lens to give you 100% of the shots that you took. It's just not able to keep up with something like the G Master or even the 200-600. But again, when it does connect, it looks pretty darn good. So here we are now looking at some birds in flight coming right at us. Again, another stressful situation for this lens. And this is the ultimate test as far as I'm concerned. And I find that this lens tends to do great on the first shot and kind of falls apart thereafter. It really struggles to keep up with fast moving subjects, but again, keep in mind of the price of this lens. It does kind of catch up in the end and does connect with several shots out of a big series, but again, its hit rate isn't that phenomenal. When it does hit, however, it does a pretty good job and the photos are quite good. Let's continue to have a look at this series and you can tell me what you think about some of these shots. It does a decent job and again, the photos are pretty darn good. It's also worth mentioning that these shots were actually taken with the newer Sony A7C, which on paper does have better autofocus than the A7 III. Here's a quick look at the focal length and what that looks like in the real world. Here's 100mm, and here's what 400 looks like alternatively. Of course, you can throw it into crop mode for a 560mm equivalent if you don't mind losing a little bit of resolution. And again, here's the difference you can expect at 100mm and 400mm. For the record, Sigma does have a 1.4 and 2 times teleconverter available, but unfortunately at this point it's limited to the L mount. Here's a few of my favorite shots that I've taken with this lens to show you just how versatile it really is. And that's probably my favorite thing about the 100-400 focal length. You can pretty much bring it anywhere. It's discreet and light enough to travel with, and it's more than capable for wildlife and my friends the birds. But is it good for anything else? Of course it is. It's great for landscape, environmental portraits, and because this lens is so sharp, you don't have to be scared of shooting the details. If you're wondering how close you're going to be able to get to your subjects, this lens does have a variable minimum focus distance. On the wide end, it's about 112 centimeters or 44 inches or so, and when you zoom in, the telephoto side of things is going to be about 63 inches or about 5¼ feet. So it's not quite as good as the G Master per se, but you can get in and get some decently close looking shots on your subjects. With 9 aperture blades, the bokeh and background separation of this lens is actually quite nice for me, but let me know what you think down in the comments. So what else can it do? Can it shoot portraits? Sure it can. And you're going to get some really nice compression at those longer focal ranges. It really is a versatile and do-it-all lens if you ask me. A quick look at the lens's image stabilization reveals that it's a great feature to have, especially when hand-holding out at 400mm. It's a welcome feature in addition to Sony's IBIS, which isn't really known for being the greatest. For me, anything over about 200mm is going to have a need for image stabilization in my books. Now let's have a detailed look at the sharpness and optics of this lens, and this is at 100mm, wide open at f5. In the center here we can see that the image is actually quite sharp, lots of detail there, no complaints. But what about the corners? The corners are actually pretty darn good as well. No complaints here at f5, and we can stop down to see a little bit of an improvement at f7.1 here, and that's going to continue all the way down to about f10 or so. After f11 and into about f14, you'll see a little bit of degradation in the very corners of the image, and that's going to continue all the way down to about f20. But again, completely usable. There's no part where it really falls apart. Pretty much a great performance at 100mm. Now let's have a look at the center of our focal range now at 200mm, and now our maximum aperture is f5.6. As you can see, the center is actually quite nice, and the corners are pretty darn good. I wouldn't say quite as good as the 100, but they perform decently, and honestly, are you really going to need perfect corner sharpness at 200mm and above? Probably not. Anyways, stop down to f8 for a noticeable improvement, and once again, that's going to continue to be pretty decent up to about f11, and after f11 you're going to see a little bit of kind of stuff creeping in here, and this photo is an example of why you need to probably invest in that tripod collar if you're going to be doing any kind of long exposure work, and it's most likely that you're not going to be shooting at 1/8 of a second on a tripod without a tripod collar, without image stabilization. But this is the result. I really didn't have a choice. There was a tiny slight breeze, and as you can see, we've got some camera shake here. So this is not a good representation, and I really wish I had a tripod collar. Now we're zoomed all the way in here to 400mm, and this is where it counts. This is why we buy these telephoto lenses. So now our maximum aperture is f6.3. The center of the image is pretty darn good. Good contrast, good sharpness, and the corners are decent. As we stop down, once again, you'll see a tiny bit of an improvement. The corners aren't perfect, but again, does it really matter at 400mm? Probably not. Again, stop down to f13 or so to see that really start to degrade. And we're at 1/10 of a second again, so we're gonna start to see that camera shake maybe from the wind. And it's unlikely that you're gonna be shooting here at 1/5 of a second, and this is the outcome that I got at f18. So the moral of the story is, don't shoot without image stabilization on a tripod at ridiculous shutter speeds, and you're probably gonna be good. This lens all around is quite good, quite sharp, absolutely no complaints. Let's have a quick look at distortion and vignetting. As you can see here at 100mm, this is with the profile correction turned off, and here it is on. Now you definitely can't see any noticeable distortion. There's a little bit of vignetting, especially wide open, but you can use that profile correction to see that disappear or stop down. Now all the way at 400mm, you can see just a little bit of pincushion distortion, nothing too crazy. It actually handles it pretty well, but use that profile correction to straighten that right out, and same thing, either use that or stop down to get rid of some of that vignetting as well. Overall, the sharpness and optics are very good for this lens, especially for the price. I did talk about the consistency of the autofocus a bit, but I did run into an issue when shooting in burst mode quite often, when the second shot would be out of focus pretty much 100% of the time. And I did reach out to Sigma about this, and they said they didn't really have any experience with this, so I'm chalking it up to maybe a single copy issue, or perhaps they're going to fix it in some later firmware. Let me know if you've had similar issues if you do own a copy of this lens down in the comments. Overall, the performance of this lens is very good for the price. And again, if you want to use this for professional work, or you're going to rely on it for nailing the shot every single time without question, consider going for the more expensive G Master. Keep in mind that this lens does fall in Sigma's contemporary line, and for what it is, it's very good. For performance as a whole, I give this lens a solid 4 stars. So wrapping it all up, I absolutely recommend this lens to anybody just getting started out, looking for a versatile lens, perhaps getting into wildlife, or just maybe thinking about getting a little bit more serious into photography. As always, here's my personal pros and cons, and overall, this lens has great value, good performance, and a decent build. I give it 4 stars. If you're a subscriber, you also know that I like to rate things on a scale from never think about again to consider to definitely buy. And I'm happy to recommend this lens to anybody looking for a budget telephoto. Now that we're finally getting some more options, I'd strongly recommend this one. And let's leave it at that, guys. Let me know your thoughts on this lens down in the comments, if you decided to pick it up or if you went with something different. If you're ready to buy this lens, I'll drop affiliate links down in the description for you as well. And if you did enjoy this video and it helped you out, consider hitting that like and subscribe button. As always, make mistakes, be yourself, and get out there and take some more pictures. See you in the next one.